Two young fathers are shot to death outside an iconic Utah restaurant.
I said, your dad has been hurt really bad.
The grief was disorienting for those left behind, until one choice changed everything.
I just remember writing this letter, and it wasn't me writing it.
Can a personal decision shape generations?
We're all falling for this guy's trick.
I'm Amy Donaldson. Season 2 of The Letter, Ripple Effect, is available now. Follow us at theletterpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Lemonada.
The best thing we've learned from nearly 500 years of contact with the American wilderness is restraint, the willingness to hold our hand, to visit such places for our soul's good, but leave no tracks. Wallace Stegner, Crossing into Eden.
Marilyn Koolstra awoke in an unfamiliar bed, in an unfamiliar house, in an unfamiliar city, in an unfamiliar country. It was the morning of Friday, August 12, 2011, day 5 of the search for her missing husband. She was in Park City, Utah, and she had come all the way from Australia with one goal, to find Eric Robinson. But Marilyn hadn't yet managed to even make contact with the people in charge of the search.
A little frustrating. I think we started calling on Friday, asking to speak. Oh, they're out on the field searching, call back. I said, could you get them to call me?
Sitting at home waiting for a phone call is not what you came here to do.
It is not, and I'm a person of action first.
Marilyn, her daughter Rachel, and her husband's hiking buddy Devin were staying together at a home that belonged to a friend of a friend. They spent the morning waiting there for a return phone call from the Duchesne County Sheriff. That call never came.
Clearly they had no news to share, otherwise, we would have heard that.
Marilyn's primary contact in Utah, Julia Geisler, was gone, out searching for Eric in the vicinity of Dead Horse Pass. Julia wasn't expected back until later that evening, so in the meantime, Marilyn, Rachel, and Devin decided to drive up the Mirror Lake Highway to the Highline Trailhead, the place where Eric was supposed to have finished his hike.
We saw where Julia had placed the makeshift sign.
5 days earlier, the cardboard scrap was still stuck to the trailhead kiosk with neon pink duct tape.
We walked around that space. We walked down the track a little bit.
Marilyn went out onto a rock ledge. It stood above a broad expanse of pine forest and provided a panoramic view. A deep gash, the gorge of the Duchesne River, cut diagonally across the landscape. Many small ponds and lakes peeked out through the trees, shimmering in the afternoon sun. Marilyn didn't know their names, but one of the largest, Mirror Lake, sat directly in front of her. Beyond its shores rose the twin summits of Bald Mountain and Reed's Peak, their steep slopes still draped in aprons of snow.
It's a very beautiful country, and I appreciated why Eric wanted to be in that space. Yeah, it was lovely.
Lovely, expansive, and awful. Rachel came up behind. She looked out over that same scene and realized her entire field of view encompassed just a tiny portion of the Uinta Range, a small sliver of the search area.
I don't think we had any concept of actually the size of what we were talking about.
They stepped back from the ledge, crossed the highway, and found a little pond called Butterfly Lake. There's a small parking area and campground there. Rachel went around placing flyers with Eric's name and photo under car windshield wipers.
Just trying to feel like we were being useful. Fingers crossed, but it felt pretty futile.
They walked around the lake, watching happy families fishing from the shoreline. They were still within sight of the highway, but Rachel couldn't keep her bearings. The mountain landmarks I described earlier were all foreign to her, and they would have been alien to Eric as well. So how would he find his way if he were lost?
I remember thinking, Eric, what were you thinking, mate? You're not young. I've hiked with him before and he's carrying this pack full of every single thing and he can hardly stand up. I was thinking, yeah. And so once I could visualize it, I then was starting to probably prepare myself for any number of realities.
My name is Dave Cawley. You are listening to Uinta Triangle, an audio documentary from KSL Podcasts. This is Episode 5, Business Casual of the Backcountry. Marilyn and Rachel were out of cell phone range while up the Mirror Lake Highway, but their phones started buzzing with alerts as they came back into service late that afternoon. Messages and voicemails poured in from friends and family back in Australia. Where are you? Any word about Eric? Marilyn wasn't sure who to respond to first.
But there was the time difference as well. You know, when we were able to call, it'd be middle of the night back here and vice versa.
A reporter with the news service Reuters had called looking for a quote. The Australian consulate in Los Angeles wanted an update. Marilyn hoped to see a missed call from the Duchesne sheriff, but no.
It was a little frustrating, but, you know, the whole scenario of him being missing was frustrating because how dare he? You know, how dare you do this?
Rachel called her husband Jeremy. She tried to describe the experience she had just had, standing near the trailhead and looking out over the vast expanse, knowing it was just a small portion of the landscape Eric intended to cross. When I spoke to Jeremy and Rachel, Jeremy told me he had struggled to comprehend the scope of it.
And no one really knew. He could have been here, there in the middle, or towards, the finish. It's just, no one really knew, did they?
No, it was literally a needle in a haystack. And that's what, when you saw it, you went, oh.
Jeremy went online and found video clips from Marilyn's TV interview, and he read through comments about the unfolding story on social media.
One guy came on early and he said, look, I've been going in the Uintas for 50 years. I said, I think the unfortunate reality is that Eric won't be found until someone basically trips over him.
A confronting thought. To that point, Jeremy hadn't entertained the idea Eric might not be alive.
I think initially we were all like, well, depending on the weather, he's just running late. It was really then after 5 days that we went, by now we probably should have heard something.
And that was the whole idea behind Marilyn's interview.
Being on TV was probably the best way of getting information.
But Marilyn wasn't the only person in the news lamenting a loved one missing in the Uinta Mountains. A crisis was at that very moment unfolding on the opposite side of the High Uintas. A 12-year-old Boy Scout had disappeared from camp at a place called Spirit Lake.
I was hoping that he would be found before dark, and the pit is back in my stomach now.
About 30 volunteers, deputies, and search and rescue in Daggett County are trying to find 12-year-old Jared Rapalato. Back at the Rapalato home in Hooper, Jared's mom, Dawn, tries to handle her emotions and the constant phone calls.
What can I do? So I've just been asking for prayers.
The Daggett County Sheriff called for air support, but the Utah Department of Public Safety helicopter was already busy in Duchesne County ferrying searchers in and out of the wilderness as they looked for Eric Robinson. The flight crew had to make a difficult decision about which mission to prioritize. Jared Rapalato's young age and the immediacy of his situation demanded attention, so the chopper diverted away from the search for Eric.
Hey Luke, you showing that Daggett Lake just over the ridge? I'm heading to the west over by Daggett, and I'm going to start griddling from there.
The chopper spent the rest of that day looking for the lost scout.
But with the daylight gone, Dawn says she's counting on her son to take care of himself and stay put, so he'll be easier to find.
I don't know if he's freaking out and wondering, or if he did stop to pray and to sit and to be still. That's what I've been praying that he would do.
A call for volunteers went out over social media. Hundreds of people made plans to show up at Spirit Lake at first light the next morning. A far different response than the search for Eric, where only a small number of volunteers had so far turned out to help. Part of the problem was no one knew where to send volunteers who were willing to look for Eric. He was 5 days overdue, but it had been much longer than that since the last sighting of him. Eric had last been seen on the shore of Fox Lake on day 3 of his hike. It was now Friday, August 12th, nearly 2 full weeks later. Marilyn couldn't understand how Eric would have gone so long without having contact with anyone else.
My experience hiking with him is that you talk and you share with those that you meet.
She was about to discover Eric did meet others, and their story would complicate the task of finding him. Julia Geisler and Blake Summers returned from a fruitless search around Dead Horse Pass late on that Friday evening. Julia and Marilyn shared a bittersweet reunion. They hadn't seen each other since first meeting 5 years earlier in San Francisco after Eric's hike on the John Muir Trail. Julia hadn't found any sign of Eric near Dead Horse or anywhere else. But she told Marilyn the fact Dead Horse Pass was still partially snowbound raised the possibility Eric might have tried to detour around it.
She had a couple of possibilities and tracks that he might have taken. So, we started planning. The dining room table turned into our command base, maps, plans, people, who can come, where are we going, what are we going to do.
Marilyn was at a disadvantage. She had no experience in the Uintas, and that made it difficult to look at the map and picture how it all fit together. Julia acted as her guide, tracing the route for one possible detour: the Granddaddy Bypass.
Julia was an invaluable asset in local knowledge and knowledge of the mountains because it was like her backyard, her playground.
I've described the Granddaddy Bypass once before. It would have extended Eric's walk by at least a few days and required some careful navigation. It was plausible Eric could be alive, but lost or delayed somewhere along that bypass. "Great," Marilyn and Rachel said. "Let's go there." But Julia suggested they work on finding more volunteers. She had put out a plea for help once already, but didn't get much response.
It was hard to get people to come out, especially during the week, because this is happening during a work week and it's last minute.
Julia tried again now that it was the weekend. She called friends who were ski patrollers, mountain bikers, trail runners, anyone who might be fit and fast enough to help. Several agreed to pack their bags and spend the next 2 days hiking in search of Eric.
It was definitely personal connections that got those folks out, not other resources.
Julia's friends were far too few in number to cover the hundreds of miles of trails that needed to be checked. She didn't yet realize it, but she was competing for volunteers with the family of that missing Boy Scout at Spirit Lake. And she was losing.
Eric's from Australia. He doesn't have a lot of friends except for me and Blake in town. And so when you have a search and rescue operation going and you're calling for volunteers, not a lot of people are showing up because they don't know the guy. If you know somebody that's out there, a family that has a kid missing, you get hundreds of people show up day after day. We really didn't have that. So we were definitely pulling on the heartstrings of, patrollers and runners and within our community or our networks of friends.
Julia gave her friends instructions where to go. They promised to report back with any findings. She, in effect, organized a shadow search and rescue, independent of, but parallel to the official effort by the Duchesne sheriff. Marilyn, meanwhile, found herself overwhelmed by the constant calls and messages coming in from Australia. Rachel stepped in, taking over as the single point of contact. She sent an email home that Friday night. Here's what it said.
Mum did a sterling job last night appearing on the Salt Lake TV station. It's in the papers and on the TV. Reuters called this afternoon from Washington, so the message is reaching far and wide.
Rachel shared her first-hand impression of the Uintas, now that she'd seen the place for herself.
It is wild, wild country and forest, better referred to as wilderness. The search has covered a fair amount of the trail Eric planned on covering. It has been done by air by the helicopter. Some of the paths have been covered by snow and detours are in place.
Eric's trail friend Devin, along with Julia's partner Blake and her sister, intended to spend the weekend searching the Granddaddy Bypass. Other friends would fan out elsewhere across the range.
As of tomorrow, all of Eric's friends will be on the trail and Mum and I will be in charge of the house, the 4 mobile phones and directing the volunteers. There has been no more news. Essentially, no one has seen Eric since the 30th.
The last known sighting, 2 weeks earlier, when a hiker had photographed Eric at Fox Lake. Rachel said no one had seen him since.
Like us, people here are baffled as to what this means. We're frustrated by the fact there is so much ground to cover, yet it is hard to scale the search more effectively until they have another sighting.
The missing Boy Scout, Jared Ropolato, turned up early on Saturday, less than 24 hours after he vanished into the woods.
Just before 9 a.m., word came he was found.
I'm happier than I think I've ever been because I was probably as scared as I'd ever been.
Dawn Ropolato is Jared's mother.
He's fine. He fell in a river this morning, so he was wet, but he's still dirty.
When he realized he didn't know where he was, he stopped and built a shelter, then buried himself in dirt to keep warm overnight. He says he learned all that from the Boy Scouts.
When we went to scout camp last year, they taught us how to build a lean-to so we can stay warm.
The quick recovery meant Duchesne County got its air support back by about midday on Saturday, August 13th, day 6 of the search for Eric. Chief Deputy Dave Boren tasked the helicopter with carrying a search party to Fox Lake. They would expand outward from the spot Eric was last seen.
Around water sources where he might have camped, not just the trail itself.
This was a subtle but significant shift in strategy. It meant the sheriff considered the entire Highline Trail cleared. Eric must be somewhere off the trail, which meant the boundaries of the search were ballooning outward. Julia continued pleading for help from the public.
I was doing more work with the sheriff, trying to, get volunteers and help coordinate on what has been searched and where.
There's a concept in the military called fog of war. It describes what happens when units in the field don't know what's going on around them. Julia and her makeshift search parties ran into this same problem.
You're out of cell phone range when you're out there searching. So even how to communicate amongst the groups, radios and that kind of thing, it's pretty limited in what you can do out there.
This problem was complicated by the fact the search had effectively forked. The Duchesne searchers weren't always aware of what was happening with Julia's friends and vice versa.
It was great to have both, but the communication between the two groups of volunteers was pretty lacking. I think Blake tells a story of being out there and encountering some folks on horses that had been searching the same drainage. And it's we didn't even know we would all be in there together.
At one point, Julia realized Duchesne didn't have jurisdiction anywhere on the north side of the Uinta Crest. That half of the range was Summit County's responsibility.
I was like, wait, which county? Where's the map? And starting to understand the delineation between the two and the resources that each had or didn't have.
I'll remind you, Julia's initial call reporting Eric missing went to Summit County, but Summit handed the case off to Duchesne because the Highline Trail is mostly within Duchesne. But many of the trails that branch off of the Highline, where Julia's friends were at that moment searching, were in Summit. Yet no one from the official side of the search was working those areas.
And I started to put out pleas to people on the county council and things like that, or city council that I knew, saying, hey, can you help me encourage Summit County to join this search? We were like, we need help. We need more resources. And sent out the plea to Summit. And they declined.
Summer sunlight glared off the concrete as Russ Alston stepped out of the air-conditioned comfort of his home in South Jordan, a suburb of Salt Lake City. He dragged a garden hose across the driveway, over to his Chevy Suburban, and started spraying down the big SUV. Blasting off a coating of dust, mud, and bug guts, the remnants of a trip to the High Uintas with a group of Boy Scouts a week earlier.
Because I'd hauled the whole crew up, all 6 of us, gear and all. And so I was washing the car, and I got a phone call from Jay, my tent partner, and he said, hey, did you read the paper this morning? And I said, no. And he said, read the front page of the Local.
Russ and Jay were neighbors and fellow scoutmasters. They, along with a third adult leader, had led 3 teenage scouts, one of them Russ's own son, on a difficult trek.
Kings Peak, the highest point in Utah, was the ultimate goal. And we were going to take 6 days to carry out that plan.
Just to be clear, Russ's scout group was not the one with the missing boy, Jared Ropalato. Russ's scouts were a few years older, in their mid to late teens, and they had been in a different part of the Uintas. Russ put down the hose and went to find his copy of that morning's Deseret News. He unfolded the paper and saw a photo of a man who looked familiar. Balding on top, gray hair at the sides. "You recognize him, don't you?" Jay asked.
He told me what I was going to read, but I read the full article, and it was essentially that Eric Robinson was overdue at the pickup point on the western extreme of the Highline Trail.
The article said the last time anyone saw Eric was 2 weeks earlier, on Saturday, July 30th, at Fox Lake. Russ realized that was wrong.
We'd seen him after the report from the newspaper.
The two men agreed they needed to call the Duchesne County Sheriff immediately and explain when and where they'd encountered Eric. The Boy Scouts of America have a long history in the Uinta Mountains, dating back almost to the organization's founding. Boy Scouts were some of the first to scale many Uinta peaks. One of the highest, Explorer Peak, is named in their honor. The Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, Wallace Stegner, one of my favorite authors, visited the Uintas as a teenage scout in 1923.
We walked no sword edge to get here, but we worked and had blisters to prove it.
Stegner penned this essay about the trip decades later, praising the Uintas as Eden.
Places as perfect as this should be as secret as they are inaccessible. They cannot stand advertising because we have a habit of destroying what we love.
Stegner's Eden didn't remain a secret. Boy Scout troops made treks all across the Uinta Range during the 1930s. Boys who completed the grueling hikes were called sourdoughs. That slang borrowed from the Klondike Gold Rush, where prospectors who survived at least one Yukon winter were called sourdoughs, in reference to the sourdough bread starter many carried on the treacherous trail to the goldfields. Utah's sourdough scouts earned a special patch for their efforts, and Russ's group was following in that tradition, in a way, during his trip in 2011.
One of the things we looked at doing was earning a 50-mile patch through the Boy Scouts.
They departed on Monday, August 1st. That would have been day 5 of Eric Robinson's hike. Half of their first day was taken up driving to the Swift Creek trailhead on the south slope of the Uintas. They started up the trail early in the afternoon at a slow pace.
It feels like when you set out on a trail in the High Uintas, after about 200 yards, you feel like you're in a survival situation. You're like, did we go 10 miles or was that just 200 yards? It's like you're out of breath.
Out of breath because of the elevation. As we've talked about before, the Uintas rise high enough that many hikers have to acclimate to avoid the risk of altitude sickness. Russ was well aware of the effects of low oxygen on the body. He'd spent years as a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force and was currently a captain for a major airline. He knew ascending slowly was the key to avoiding trouble.
You don't want to be too fast. It's the tortoise and the hare syndrome.
The scout group hiked north, up the canyon of Yellowstone Creek. They went about 5 miles, or 8 kilometers, before making their first camp. They resumed hiking the next morning, after a leisurely breakfast.
Broke camp, packed up. We were probably on the trail by 9-ish.
The trail paralleled Yellowstone Creek's east bank. Russ couldn't see the creek much of the time because it was entrenched in a narrow gorge, but he could hear the roar of the frothy water cascading over rocks. The cool of morning soon gave way to the heat of midday. Russ monitored his scouts to make sure they were staying hydrated, another key to avoiding altitude sickness. He called for a break at about 1:45 p.m.
Let everybody get their breath, drop their pack, you're sweaty, cool off a little bit, recharge with water.
During this break, Russ spotted someone approaching from the opposite direction.
A gentleman comes down the trail that we meet going up.
This man looked a little disheveled.
But he had really good boots. He was in shorts, so lightweight. That's kind of the standard business casual of the backcountry, right? You know, you're probably wearing the same clothes if you're lightweight for multiple days. So the creases, your nicely pressed t-shirts don't look quite as nice, maybe, and you have stubble.
Beyond clothing, Russ could see this solo hiker was well equipped.
Trekking poles, a good internal frame backpack that was self-contained. He didn't have a lot of gear dangling or extra strapped onto his pack. He looked fit and like he'd been out a few days, and he was prepared for that.
The man stopped and said, "G'day, mate. How are you going?"
He was from Australia, definitely an Aussie accent.
With a dash of Scottish, which I clearly can't mimic. The man introduced himself as Eric.
Super pleasant, solo hiker.
Russ felt curious about what would bring an older man so far across the world to walk such a remote trail all by himself.
He started telling us of experiences he'd had, on other treks. He'd been in the Himalayas, and he may have listed a few other places, but they were exotic places for, Intermountain West USA. And he'd mentioned he and his wife had trekked a lot of those times. That is their hobby. That's what they spent their summers doing.
But Eric said this time, his wife Marilyn hadn't been able to join him.
We chat with this gentleman for 20 to 30 minutes maybe about his experience and what we're doing, and exchange, ideas on the trail.
Eric said a little ways up the canyon, they would come to a crossing of Yellowstone Creek. There was no bridge, no mossy log, no rocks to hop. They'd have to get their feet wet.
So he was kind enough to explain that where the Mark Trail crossed the river, that it was a little bit more channeled and deep. And he said if you just go upriver 50 yards, just a little bit more, that you'd find it opened up and there's more of a gravel bar and it was not as deep. So he was, again, you realize his experience, he knows what he's looking for in river crossings.
Russ asked where Eric had come from. Eric said he was hiking the Uinta Highline Trail. That didn't make sense to Russ.
Because he was headed south now, and we were headed north up into that basin.
The Highline Trail runs east to west. Eric was not on the Highline. In fact, he was heading away from it. His encounter with Russ occurred 5 miles, or 8 kilometers south of the Highline. Russ knew the Highline at the head of Yellowstone Creek, where he was headed with his scouts, sat above timberline in wide open alpine tundra. It seemed implausible. This experienced Australian trekker could have mistakenly wandered so far off route, going so far downhill into the trees without realizing his mistake.
I believe he recognized he was off trail, and he asked us for kind of some assistance or guidance on that.
As they talked, Eric described crossing Anderson Pass on the Uinta Highline Trail a day earlier. He said he had lost the trail on the west side of the pass.
And part of it was because of the snow. A lot of the trail is covered because of that heavy and late melt-off.
Remember the mountaineer Art Lang, who we met before? He shared his story of encountering these same snowdrifts and going over the top of one of them on a knife edge of snow called a moat. Art crossed Anderson Pass on August 9th, more than a week after Eric. And a week of warm sunshine can melt a lot of snow in the Uintas. So the drifts were larger and more dangerous when Eric reached them on August 1st. Eric told Russ he had struggled to get around the snowdrifts. Rather than go above, the way Art did, Eric went below.
His description was letting himself down over more than just boulders, but kind of cliff faces. He had scraped up knuckles, skin, a little bit roughed up like the mountains can do, and maybe his knees. I can't picture exactly, but he was scuffed up, as I remember, a little bit, and he was complaining about that.
Eric said he had been unable to get back to the trail. He had camped that night in the Yellowstone Basin, woke up that morning, and continued on his way. Not long after, Eric came across a herd of sheep. He told Russ he found a pair of sheep herders and tried to talk to them, but a language barrier made that impossible. The herders gave Eric some coffee and posed for a couple pictures. Side note, these herders never came forward. To my knowledge, they were never identified or questioned. Eric's story of leaving the Highline Trail to get around steep snow on Anderson Pass made sense. But Russ felt confused about the part after that. The details were murky.
The only thing I came away questioning was really his navigation, how he got off trail and couldn't get back on efficiently.
According to Russ, Eric said he had found a trail once down in the basin and followed it. That was the trail they were both now on. But again, it wasn't the Highline.
We got maps out, and I kind of described some of those options he had to return to the Highline.
Russ told Eric he could either backtrack up the trail they were on, the Yellowstone Creek Trail, or continue downstream for another 30 minutes, watching for another trail that split off going west.
I described a junction a little bit downriver. He could continue farther, hit a T in the trail, and then take a bypass to kind of an end run to get back onto the Highline Trail.
Let me help you picture what Russ is describing. Think of the letter U, or the shape of a horseshoe. Eric had started his day at the top right side of the horseshoe. He was supposed to cross the short gap to the top left side, just a little hop over Tungsten Pass. Instead, Eric had gone downstream along Yellowstone Creek, the right side of the horseshoe. That's where he ran into Russ and the scouts. The trail junction a bit farther downstream was the curve at the bottom of the horseshoe. If Eric went that way, the trail would carry him up along the left side of the horseshoe back to the Highline. Walking this horseshoe, instead of hopping the gap, would be an exhausting, time-wasting detour. But on the upside, it would take Eric through the beautiful Garfield Basin, a place he had not seen otherwise.
During the course of conversation, that's what I recommended to him.
Eric thought it over, then agreed. He would follow the horseshoe. They folded up their maps, but as they prepared to part ways, Russ felt a twinge of concern. He warned Eric taking the horseshoe would mean having to cross Yellowstone Creek again.
I didn't know what that water crossing was going to hold for him. I didn't see it.
Eric thanked Russ for the information, said farewell, and started off down the trail. Within a few moments, he disappeared around a bend. Russ roused his scouts, and they resumed their march up the Yellowstone. Soon after, gray storm clouds rolled across the sky. It started to rain, the cold, pelting kind of rain, just on the verge of turning into hail. Russ wondered if the storm might make Yellowstone Creek swell, just as Eric, the Aussie trekker, was trying to cross. Scoutmaster Russ Alston's report to the Duchesne Sheriff made an immediate impact on the search. Chief Deputy Dave Boren shared the sighting with the media, telling reporters he wasn't giving up hope of finding Eric alive. He also informed Julia, who passed the word on to Marilyn.
So there was renewed hope of some conclusion.
The sighting along Yellowstone Creek was both more recent and farther along the trail than the previous last sighting at Fox Lake. It was 10 days old rather than 14. 4 extra days might not seem like much, but if Eric was in a survival situation, it might be the difference between finding him alive or not. Marilyn and Rachel went to their map of the High Uintas and found the spot on the Yellowstone. This became the new focus for the search.
Then there was the question of he was a little off the trail, he was a little bit lost. Did he know what he was doing? Was he a little disoriented? He seemed a little fatigued. I think doubt and in the absence of information, all these other questions would arise. And I then think, well, what was he doing there?
Marilyn and Rachel were trying to understand what Eric's mental state might have been at the time he met Russ. They didn't have a way to speak with Russ themselves, so the best they could do was use the time and place he'd provided to calculate where Eric might have gone next.
We have a bit more understanding of where he was last seen, how long he would travel, in a day.
They now had 3 dates and places. Eric's departure from Chipeta Lake on July 28th, his sighting at Fox Lake on July 30th, and the encounter along Yellowstone Creek on August 2nd. From this, they could derive a rough estimate of Eric's pace. He had averaged fewer than 6 miles per day. Marilyn, Rachel, and Julia used that to estimate how far Eric might have traveled in the time since. They also considered other variables.
The weather became a very significant factor in all of this.
What was the concern with the weather?
The winds, the rain, the storm that had come through, and just what he would have done in those circumstances. From my previous experience, he would have pitched the tent and stayed inside.
It remained plausible Eric might have sheltered in his tent for 2 or 3 days, then proceeded at a slow pace. He could still be out there, alive. Or maybe in haste, trying to make up ground under rain and fog, he slipped and fell.
If something like that had happened and he was conscious, he would have set off that EPIRB.
The emergency beacon.
That was the bargaining piece of his, I can go and hike because I've got this EPIRB. If something happens, I go off the trail or whatever, I can set the EPIRB off. Why didn't it go off? Why haven't we had a beacon? Because something significant has stopped him from doing that.
Rachel summarized all of this in another email to friends and family back in Australia. Here's what she wrote that Saturday night.
We were sitting quietly at 6 p.m, contemplating yet another day of disappointment, when the phone rang and the sheriff reported an official sighting. He was contacted today by a Boy Scout leader who spoke for some time to Eric on August 2nd. Whilst that is still 10 days ago, we feel this is still some positive progress.
Rachel said the sighting now put searchers directly on Eric's tail.
Eric had been and was moving very slowly, slower than he or others had anticipated. It is still feasible that he is trying to make his way out and is lost somewhere. We still have hope that this is the case.
A moment ago, Marilyn raised the question, why hadn't Eric's emergency beacon gone off? I think taking a closer look at Eric's experience on Anderson Pass might help us answer that. Eric didn't like snow. We've heard Marilyn say that several times.
I think he would avoid it. I mean, if it's a light smattering of snow, that's no real hindrance. But if you're encountering, big pockets of snow, he would be thinking, how am I going to do this?
Eric wasn't a climber, but Marilyn told me he knew how to scramble, using both hands and feet to move across steep terrain. She'd seen him do it on the Annapurna circuit.
We had to scarper up shale rocks to be able to steer clear of the yaks stampeding down the track. I can remember hanging onto each other on the side of the trail, as these yaks went thundering past.
Eric's second trip to Nepal, less than a year before his Uinta Highline hike, introduced him to the dangers of crossing steep snow. And remember, he had lost his closest adventure buddy, Alan Beck, in a fatal fall from glacier ice in New Zealand. So I think it's safe to assume the idea of crossing the drift spooked Eric. He wouldn't risk taking it head on. We know Eric found another way around because he told the Scoutmaster Russ about it. But even Russ didn't really understand the risks Eric took in doing that until he set eyes on the snowdrift himself. Russ and the scouts headed for Kings Peak the day after meeting Eric. They followed the Highline Trail going east, uphill, toward Anderson Pass.
The trail is well marked, I find out, the next day going up.
That is, until they reached the edge of the drift.
It's just all snow field, and it's deep, packed up 5 feet, maybe more, you can't really tell.
That's more than a light smattering, and it was steep.
I'd have to get my geometry set out to figure out that angle, but it looks like it's about a 45-degree angle straight off, and 45 degrees is like a roof.
Russ looked for a safe way to go above or below the drift, but couldn't spot one. He tested the snow with his boot. It felt slick and unstable. He could probably get across by kicking steps in the snow, but one bad step might prove fatal.
If you slip, you can't necessarily stop yourself on snow if you're not equipped with an ice axe, ropes tethered up together, which we weren't. And preparation, one of my boys that we're leading is in tennis shoes. So he doesn't have any grip and the ability to dig a heel in because he's got flat-bottomed Converse, high-top tennis shoes.
Russ told his scouts this was as far as they would go. They abandoned their hopes of reaching the summit of Kings Peak. It's worth noting Russ's description of the drift is the closest we can get to seeing it through Eric's eyes, and Russ's decision not to risk crossing it reinforces my belief that the snow spooked Eric. Before the Boy Scouts retreated back to their camp, Russ took a moment to picture the path Eric must have taken to bypass the drift, leaving the trail and descending into the Yellowstone Basin.
I kind of sorted through and understood what he was describing, that he came off the hill and kind of went directly downhill. And then he described kind of hand over foot of letting himself down the face of the rock. A treacherous path, basically.
What does treacherous really mean, though? To find out, I needed to see the spot for myself. That's one of the reasons I embarked on my own Uinta Highline hike in 2023, following in Eric's footsteps. My hike came during a big snow year in the Uintas, just like 2011, and I intentionally started my hike on the same date as Eric, July 28th. I reached Anderson Pass 2 days ahead of Eric's pace, and thought I might also run into dangerous snow.
Okay, I'm looking at one of the snowfields that Eric Robinson likely had to contend with.
From a distance, I could tell the drift was much smaller than it would have been for Eric.
It is retreated high enough that it's not covering the trail. But 2 or 3 weeks ago, this would have probably descended to a point where it covered the trail, and I either would have had to cross it, climb up above it, or go down below it.
I'll remind you, this is the same place Art, the mountaineer, told us he circled above the drift and crossed the top of it on that moat. Eric had gone the other way, trying to divert below the drift. I looked down the steep talus that dropped away to my left and felt my stomach flop.
All right. I am right at the base of this snowfield. Thank goodness it is not covering the trail for me, because scrambling down that rock pile looks like a nightmare. Oh my word, because that just ends in cliffs.
I could see the way Eric must have gone, stepping and sliding toward the edge, dislodging stones that clattered over the brink. He would have found a notch or gap in the cliff where he could lower himself down.
So if I had to pick my way down, I can kind of see how I could scramble down this chute, but that looks like it cliffs out. That would be extremely unfun.
Remember, Eric's not a rock climber. He wasn't carrying any climbing gear. A fall could easily injure or kill him. And Russ, the scoutmaster, had noticed scrapes and bruises that suggested Eric likely had a close call.
Probably had some slip falls where he lost his traction, fell on his butt, caught himself with his hands, scraped his knuckles up.
Eric chose to take this treacherous path rather than use his emergency beacon. I can think of two explanations why. First, he didn't want to admit defeat and thought the challenge was within his ability to overcome, which, obviously, it was. Second, Eric kept the beacon in his backpack, which meant he couldn't get to it once he had started climbing down through the cliffs, using both hands and feet to keep from falling. And by the time he got to the bottom of the cliffs, he didn't need to use it because he wasn't in life-threatening danger anymore.
Part of what that really impresses upon me is just how tough and determined Eric was.
Eric was a problem solver, unlikely to call for rescue unless he was literally dying. And this will be an important point to remember later in our story. Maybe it was just the cool breeze on my sweaty back, but I shuddered. Best to keep moving. I continued on, stepping over a trickle of meltwater as it flowed across the trail. Thinking through all of this while headed down from Anderson Pass put me in a strange headspace. I felt hyper-aware of my own vulnerability, especially because I was alone. If I had an accident, who would even know?
It's not a fall to your death spot, but it is a fall and hurt yourself spot. So let's not do that. Big step.
It's possible to go days at a time without seeing another person on the Uinta Highline Trail, and the meetings you do have tend to be brief.
Hello.
Morning to you.
Morning.
How's it going?
Well.
Good. Where are you coming from?
To the top before it rains.
Oh, yeah. You're pushing.
Will do.
Have a good summit.
Yeah. I need you to be the first guy I've seen fit.
I love that. That's the way it should be.
This solitude is part of what draws me to wild places. But it can also amplify the consequences if something goes wrong. I found myself wondering what would happen if I failed to finish my hike. Say I disappeared, like Eric. When would people notice I was overdue? Who would come looking for me? Would any other hikers remember seeing me? 3 women came into view as I was mulling this over. They were hiking up to the pass as I headed down.
I will yield to uphill traffic.
I found a safe spot to step aside as they approached.
Hello.
Hey, where are y'all coming from?
We started at China Meadows.
Okay.
And then we camped at Upper Red Castle.
Nice.
These hikers noticed the cameras, audio recorder, microphones, stands, and cables dangling off my pack.
Yeah, you got a lot of stuff on you.
Yeah,
that's
makes the climb even worse.
They asked what I was up to. I told them I was working on a podcast about an Australian backpacker who had disappeared up here.
Coming down off of Anderson, he lost the trail and went straight down this scree field. And then he camped down here, and so the Highline, the low little knob over here, that's Tungsten Pass. Okay. All he had to do was go over to Tungsten, hop it, and then head straight west Porcupine. Instead, he went all the way down this river drainage. So it's why did he do that? Was he trying to bail out? Did he get lost?
Bail out. Remember that phrase. I'll come back to it.
What's your podcast? I'd be interested to listen.
It's not going to be out for a while. It'll probably be called Uinta Triangle, but we don't know for sure yet.
Sick.
There's nothing more cringeworthy than listening to a dude talk about his podcast, but I figured the easiest way for these hikers to find this show, once it eventually came out, would be for them to follow another series I had already released.
If you're from Salt Lake, have you ever heard of Cold, the podcast?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We've
all watched that. Yeah.
That's me.
Oh, that's it?
Yeah.
I didn't want to embarrass myself any further, so I wished them a safe hike and continued on my way.
Okay. Have fun. Bye. Safe hike.
Yeah, you too. Excited to hear it.
Me too.
Eric made it safely down to the floor of the Yellowstone Cirque, but he was off the trail and couldn't see any obvious markers pointing the way back to it. That's because there aren't any. Marilyn told me that would have frustrated Eric.
He probably would have sworn, first off, get a bit of heat out of it, but he would have been into the problem-solving mode of, what do I do about this? He would have been consulting with his map. He would have been checking on the GPS.
Many of the trails Eric had previously walked across the world were marked with posts or blazes. Those are carved symbols on tree trunks or bits of reflective flagging. The Uinta Highline doesn't have blazes. Sometimes the highline's marked by cairns or piles of rocks, but even those are infrequent at best. And we know Eric complained about this when he encountered Russ, the Boy Scout leader, the next day. Eric told Russ he wandered a bit before finding a sheep herder camp. I know where that herder camp is because I went there too. You already heard me complain about all the garbage I found there in an earlier bit of our story. The herder camp sits right near an important intersection where the Highline Trail and the Yellowstone Creek Trail meet.
I'm standing at the junction of the Yellowstone Creek and Smith Fork Pass Trail with the Uinta Highline Trail. And these trails make a rough X. Yellowstone Creek one way, Smith Fork Pass the other way, Uinta Highline crossing right between them. As I turn, I can look down and see the meadows where Eric observed sheep grazing.
This trail junction's just above timberline. A hiker here has unobstructed views of the surrounding terrain. Major landmarks, including Kings Peak, are easy to see and identify.
This would have been a very unusual place for Eric to lose his way. I can easily see the Uinta Highline Trail cut through open meadow going up toward Tungsten Pass, but I can also very easily see the Yellowstone Creek Trail. So did he inadvertently walk right by that intersection? Was he distracted by the view of the sheep? Was he going down to take a look at the sheep? Or did he perhaps have other thoughts in mind about whether or not he wanted to continue on the Uinta Highline or bail out, end his trip by hiking out the Yellowstone Creek Trail?
There's that phrase, bail out again. I should explain what I mean by that. When the story of Eric's encounter with Russ and the Boy Scouts made the news back in 2011, the common assumption was that he had become lost. And it made sense, at least at a surface level. Eric didn't know the Uintas, and he had even told Russ he lost the trail coming off Anderson Pass. But the more I learned about Eric, his experience, and his equipment, the more I came to doubt his turn down the Yellowstone Creek Trail was a mistake. Put yourself in Eric's boots. He runs into steep snow on Anderson Pass that reminds him of his friend Alan's death in New Zealand. He takes a dangerous detour down through cliffs, and once safely to the floor of the Yellowstone Cirque, struggles to find the trail again.
He would have been looking for solutions to what the problem might be.
So he takes out his map and GPS and uses them to find his way back to the trail. The next morning, he continues on the Highline until he comes to a four-way intersection. Here, he faces a choice. Continue on the Highline, with 5 more passes still to cross, including the notoriously difficult Dead Horse, or leave the Highline and hike down the Yellowstone Creek Trail, ending his trek.
He knew well enough that you could walk out of the trails along your major walks at many points.
I asked Marilyn, would Eric bail out if he felt unsafe?
I've asked myself that. I don't know, but he was not a quitter. He would persist and persist and, he was a stayer for the journey. So I'm not convinced that he would pull the pin on it.
But Marilyn's never seen the slope Eric descended with her own eyes. I've showed her photos, but they don't do it justice. As I stood at the intersection of the Highline and Yellowstone Creek trails, I considered my next move. To follow Eric's path, I would have to leave the highline here.
The walk I'm about to do today is probably going to be the worst part of this trip. And I've known that ever since I started planning this months ago. Because in order to follow Eric's route, I have to spend hours hiking basically useless miles away from the highline, dropping in elevation, and then ultimately climbing all that elevation back to end up almost exactly where I started.
This is that horseshoe I described earlier. I was standing at the top right, looking across the gap toward the top left.
I'm looking at Tungsten Pass right now, and I'll be honest, I don't want to spend a whole day walking down this trail into the trees when my goal is just over there. I mean, I could be over that in 30 minutes.
Tungsten Pass isn't much of a challenge. It's not steep and doesn't hold snow. It's by far the least imposing hurdle Eric would have had to cross, so I can't imagine him being intimidated by it. But I know he didn't cross it, so neither would I. I turned off the Highline Trail and headed down Yellowstone Creek. The forest deepened around me. The creek ran by my side. It was obvious I was leaving the high and wild. At one point, I even passed another trail junction with a sign pointing eastward to Bluebell Pass. Eric would have seen the same sign.
This leads me to believe that Eric knew very well that he was leaving the highline. He was not lost, he had not made a mistake. He had already crossed the Yellowstone Creek, having to ford it. Then he came to this trail junction, saw this sign that said Highline Trail, back the way he came, and yet he continued on down toward the Swift Creek trailhead as if his plan was to leave.
The problem with this theory is, as far as we know, Eric didn't say a word about bailing out to Russ and the Boy Scouts. But then I wonder if he would have. Again, put yourself in Eric's place. He's a confident, experienced trekker. Assume he got spooked coming off Anderson Pass. He's decided to bail and is on his way out when he runs into a group of teenagers lounging trailside, at least one of them in sneakers. Maybe he feels a bit embarrassed and decides he's overreacting. Eric doesn't have a good explanation for why he's so far off route at this point, so he plays it off as being disoriented. I ran this hypothetical by Julia. She thought it sounded plausible.
Who knows what the actual conversation was between the two parties? What was said by Eric, who knows? How that was interpreted. You're with a bunch of Boy Scout kids. It's like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I know where I am. He had his GPS unit. He has his maps.
Eric bailing out and then changing his mind is the only scenario that makes sense to me, having walked this same path. I just don't think Eric would have made such an obvious navigational error and compounded it at every opportunity. Back in 2011, news reports about the sighting of Eric along Yellowstone Creek generated a burst of public interest. It brought out new volunteers. Marilyn, Rachel, and Julia spent Sunday, August 14th, day 7 of the search, sending them out with assignments.
Julia had a constant stream of people coming and going from the house, directing them to different places. It was a lot of meeting people for the first time and in that emotional state, still not even connecting the names and who does what.
And some of these introductions felt a bit bizarre, like one involving a man who wanted to track Eric through supernatural means.
There was a tracker who appeared from somebody's contact who came and talked to me and said, what do you feel about this? And tell me about that. And, he was going out there with the vibes to try and locate Eric.
When I saw the word tracker in the official reports, I was picturing, this looking for the footprints. Your description of tracker is much more hippy-dippy.
Well, that's the person that was in front of me. looking for footprints and evidence would be more my experience. And I'm going, okay, so this maybe is just someone else's different skill, and I'm ready to go with that.
You're taking any help you
Yes,
can get,
taking,
right?
That's right. Mm.
Rachel found herself answering questions from strangers about how Eric might have reacted if attacked by a bear, or how he'd manage a broken leg.
You know, there was even this question that foul play.
Maybe a shifty sheep herder had done Eric in, or another hiker killed him in a botched backcountry robbery.
And they wanted me. They suggested that maybe I raise that with the police to be given more consideration. I was like, get out of town. Like, I am not doing, like, they will think I am crazy. But then the question did play on your mind about, well, maybe that did happen.
The more rational explanation was Eric might have been swept away by the waters of Yellowstone Creek shortly after parting ways with Russ and the Boy Scouts. That was the working theory at the Duchesne County Sheriff's Office. Chief Deputy Dave Boren dispatched a search party on horseback, instructing them to travel to that creek crossing. If they didn't find Eric there, they were to continue up into the Garfield Basin, along the route Eric told Russ he planned to take to get back to the Highline Trail. And Marilyn, at long last, received a personal call from the sheriff. He invited her to come meet with him in person at 8 a.m. the next morning. Marilyn felt a surge of hope.
There's a lot of action up there in the mountains, and hope sort of crept back into my thoughts that I would be taking him home alive rather than, any other way.
Rachel sent another email that night.
It's 9:30 p.m. here. We are preparing for a long day tomorrow.
She said they had borrowed a car and would rise early the next morning to drive out and meet the sheriff.
The sighting yesterday buoyed our spirits. The knowledge of the dates of the storms in the area also helps us accurately plot where he may have been in stormy and windy weather. We've carefully plotted the timeline for a slow trip and for a quicker trip. All of this information, together with the last sighting, have helped enormously in terms of where to direct the resources. The helicopter is back on board. There are no missing Boy Scouts to divert it. If there is room on the chopper, I will go out for a day trip to search with one of the experienced searchers. I know you have all been sending your thoughts, prayers, and energies. Keep it up, as we are very hopeful of some news in the coming days.
My hike following Eric's path continued down the Yellowstone Creek Trail. After a few hours, I reached the T intersection where Eric would have had to make a choice. Straight ahead to bail out, or a 90-degree turn to the right to head back up to the Highline. A critical decision point at the bottom of the horseshoe. Which path did Eric choose? We know he didn't come out to the trailhead, so he must have made the turn. That meant I had to do the same. I immediately ran into the ford of Yellowstone Creek, where some people suspected Eric might have slipped and been swept away. With caution, I crossed knee-deep pools of water. The pressure of the current pushed against my legs. My feet slipped over slimy rocks. It wouldn't take much to fall. Once on the far side, I started up the trail to the Garfield Basin, but soon discovered it was in terrible condition.
Like, picture rocks the size of your fist down to rocks the size of peas as just a loose gravel. Spread that on a slope, that's your frickin' trail. Every 500 yards or so, you're gonna run into a tree that's fallen down across this trail.
A steady stream of cold rain started to fall as I did hurdles over these blowdowns.
It's just uphill, grind, grind, grind. And of course, it's raining for 2 hours as I'm doing this grind. And so now, that gravel is on a surface of mud. Yeah, just stinking mud.
I was wet, tired, and if you can't tell, a little cranky.
Today is day 4 of my Uinta Highline crossing. This is supposed to be the halfway day. And it is the frickin' low point of my mood. So far, no question.
I imagine Eric would have felt much the same. He too would have dealt with rain on this part of his walk. The searchers who came up through the Garfield Basin on horses didn't find any indication he had walked this trail. No proof he ever returned to the Uinta Highline. But then, the rain would have washed away his footprints. My storm lasted for hours. It finally broke as I emerged from tree cover next to a body of water called 5 Point Lake. A chill wind came and went, rippling the lake's surface, making a million little glimmers of sunlight sparkle. The beauty abolished my bad mood. The world felt fresh, washed clean. I pushed on northward, crossing soggy meadows, my soaked shoes squelching with every step. The sun drooped against the edge of a high ridge to my left, casting shadows in the shapes of mountains across my path. I had hoped to make it all the way back to the Highline Trail before nightfall, but my tired legs were starting to stumble. So I found a patch of gnarled, stubby trees growing in the shelter of a large boulder and dropped my pack there.
I am spent. Today was a very long day. I just rolled into what is going to have to be camp for night 4, my halfway mark.
I assessed my situation as the daylight dwindled.
It rained for a solid 3 hours this afternoon. Everything got soaked. I was really demoralized.
A blanket of dark cloud began to slide in again, just as the last of the sun disappeared. My golden hour reprieve was over.
Some not happy clouds are blowing in from the west, so I need to get into dry clothes, get dinner cooked, and get shelter up fast before I get rained on again. So that's what you're going to listen to me do.
I won't actually make you listen to all that. We'll fast forward to when I crawled into my tent and settled down to bed. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept spinning, running through all the could-have-beens. Like, what if Eric hadn't bumped into the Boy Scouts on that day?
Another few hours, he would have been to a trailhead, and he could have bailed out.
He might have made it home to Marilyn, and I wouldn't be here telling you this story.
But then there's that conversation with Russ Alston and his group, and this turns everything around.
That chance encounter changed Eric's trajectory. Instead of ending his hike early, he must have recommitted himself to completing the Uinta Highline. I imagined how he might have felt, resting in this exact same spot after a long, difficult day. Was he relieved, resolved, anxious, unsure? Did he think of home, of Marilyn, and the story he would tell her about this adventure when he returned? The breeze died down, and an eerie silence settled. A lone coyote bellowed in the distance. As I at last began to drift in and out of restless sleep, I wondered what songs the wild things once sang for Eric's ears alone. Uinta Triangle includes immersive field recordings made in real outdoor locations. For the best listening experience, please consider using a good pair of stereo headphones. And if you'd like to build a better picture of the places we visit, you can find maps, photos, and video at uintatriangle.com. That's Uinta, spelled UINTA, triangle.com. Find us on social media using @Uinta Triangle. Bringing you this story has been an effort years in the making. To support this kind of work, please follow the show and share it with your friends. You can also help us by subscribing to Lemonada Premium, right in your podcast player. It gets you access to exclusive bonus episodes. Here's producer Andrea Smartin with a peek at the latest bonus.
In this podcast, we learn that if someone isn't found within a couple days of going missing in the Uinta Mountains, chances are they'll never be found. Bonus episode 5 is about every parent's nightmare, the story of 3-year-old Benjamin Myrup, who was lost in the Uintas. It's also the story of a community that pulled together in a short window of time to search for him.
Uinta Triangle is researched and written by me, Dave Cawley. I also did the field recording. Andrea Smartin is lead producer and sound designer, with contributing producers Ben Kubrick and Jenny Ament. Our main score and original music are by Allison Leighton Brown. Additional voices in this episode from Dan Bomas. Uinta Triangle is a production of KSL Podcasts and Lemonada Media. My personal thanks to the following past and present members of the KSL Podcasts team: Aaron Mason, Amy Donaldson, Felix Bennell, Josh Tilton, Kellyanne Halverson, Nina Ernest, Ryan Meeks, and Trent Sell. Finally, from me to you, please remember, wherever your life's trail takes you, none of us ever truly walk alone.
Suffering is inevitable, and it sucks, but we're still expected to thrive. Everything Happens is a podcast for people who are tired of coffee mug platitudes and want something with a little more teeth and a lot more heart. Each week, Duke professor Kate Bowler talks with guests like Glennon Doyle, Sharon McMahon, and Coach K about grief, absurdity, and the beautiful, terrible days we actually live through. No hustle culture, no silver linings, just real talk and good company. Listen to Everything Happens wherever you get your podcasts.
2 young fathers are shot to death outside an iconic Utah restaurant.
I said, "Your dad has been hurt really bad."
The grief was disorienting for those left behind, until one choice changed everything.
I just remember writing this letter, and it wasn't me writing it.
Can a personal decision shape generations?
We're all falling for this guy's trick.
I'm Amy Donaldson. Season 2 of The Letter, Ripple Effect, is available now. Follow us at theletterpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Lemonada.
I heard from my bed his bugle breath go by, and the drum of his heart in the measure of an old song. I shall travel into silence, and in that fierce country when we meet, he will know he has been away too long. Judith Wright, Lost Child.
The dim blue light of pre-dawn began to warm as Art Lang arrived at Duchesne County's makeshift search command post. Art, I'll remind you, is the backpacker and mountaineer who hiked the Uinta Highline Trail about a week behind the missing Australian trekker Eric Robinson. Art had finished his hike on a Friday afternoon. Now, on Monday morning, he was eager to join the hunt.
I said to myself, I'm going to go back in, and I loaded up my pack again.
He parked near a grove of quaking aspen trees, surrounded by sagebrush, just off to the side of Moon Lake. It was the start of August 15th, 2011, day 8 of the search for Eric. And in Art's view, the sheriff in charge of the search was,
at that point, kind of desperate.
Desperate for help. Desperate for ideas. Desperate for a stroke of good luck. Eric's wife, Marilyn Koolstra, and her daughter, Rachel Marsden, were desperate too. Desperate to be included, to be taken seriously. They felt the Duchesne County Sheriff had held them at arm's length ever since they'd arrived in Utah, failing to return phone calls, not involving them in the search efforts.
And Rachel came with her hiking boots and her hiking gear. She was equipped and ready to go out there and search for her stepfather, more her close friend than stepfather. She was a woman of action and wanted to be useful.
So at the same time Art was arriving at Moon Lake, Marilyn and Rachel were on their way to the headquarters of the Duchesne County Sheriff's Office.
I think it was like 4 a.m. and they were driving. It was a long drive just to get to there.
It took about an hour to get from the house where they were staying in Park City, Utah, to the small rural town of Duchesne.
Yeah, it was just a building in the middle of somewhere that seemed to be not very busy, not a lot of personnel in there.
The sheriff's chief deputy, Dave Boren, escorted Marilyn and Rachel into a room called the EOC, or Emergency Operations Center, a utilitarian space with fluorescent lights, plastic folding tables, and a bank of landline telephones. It was supposed to be the nerve center of the search, but to Rachel, it seemed strangely quiet.
It was like, really? Is this it? There's just like you and us?
She'd expected to see a crowd of people getting ready to head out into the mountains. Where were they? Boren explained the searchers were meeting at Moon Lake, about a 45-minute drive farther north. That's where Rachel wanted to be, not in some office building. She said she wanted to go out looking for Eric.
You know, I think I made it known that I felt that I could do that, and I was willing to do that if they thought it was helpful.
Boren told her that wasn't a good idea.
It was like, you leave it to us, we've got this under control.
In the eyes of the sheriff's office, placing a family member of a missing person in the mountains, especially one who had never set foot in the Uintas before, was a recipe for trouble. But to Rachel, the response felt dismissive and patronizing. Like, "Don't you worry, little lady. Let the big boys handle this." Marilyn and Rachel's first in-person meeting with the people in charge of the search was off to a rough start, and it got worse when someone, Marilyn doesn't remember who, tried to break the tension with a joke. They said it was a good thing she'd been in Australia when Eric disappeared. After all, the romantic partner is always the prime suspect.
Yeah, that was the comment.
What a wild thing to say to someone's spouse who's just flown across the world. Yeah, but, thankfully she wasn't there and they didn't waste time and resources.
Rachel laughs about it now, but she wasn't laughing then. The search for Eric was entering its second week, and she knew the odds were against him.
Too much time's passed. There's something untoward's happened, but what's that untoward? And are we actually going to figure that out?
Search and rescue missions are expensive. They require huge expenditures for wages and overtime, equipment, food, and fuel. They also expose the rescuers to risk. Searchers can confront the very same hazards that caused the person they're looking for to go missing in the first place. There comes a time when it's just too expensive or too dangerous for a search to continue. But to the families of the missing, talking about these practicalities can come across as insensitive, like officials are placing a dollar figure on the value of a human life. While researching this story, I came across a study that analyzed 5 years of search and rescue data from the state of Oregon. It said most survivors were found within 2 days of a person being reported missing, and almost all searches concluded within 4 days, with the recovery of the victim either alive or dead. Beyond 4 days, the odds of mission success dropped to about 1 in 100. That's the point, the study said, when it's often not worth the expense or the risk of a search continuing. The search for Eric had already dragged on twice that long. But the authors of the study also cautioned not to rely too strictly on these statistics. They stressed odds of survival after 4 days were low, but not zero. There are always outliers in the data. Marilyn still hoped Eric could be that outlier, the 1 out of 100.
How hard can it be to find somebody out there?
My name is Dave Cawley. You are listening to Uinta Triangle, an audio documentary from KSL Podcasts. This is episode 6, Dead Reckoning. A wispy layer of cirrus cloud, high in the atmosphere, turned pink, then orange, catching rays of the rising sun, as Marilyn and Rachel drove away from the sheriff's office headquarters, headed for Moon Lake.
It was such a trek to even arrive at where they were searching from, but it was a big process.
Moon Lake sits right on the southern boundary of the High Uintas Wilderness area, about 12 miles or 20 kilometers south of the Highline Trail. The mountain air felt sharp and cold as Rachel stepped out of the car. She hoped to find hundreds of volunteers there, like the crowds who had turned out to search for a missing Boy Scout 2 days earlier. But she saw fewer than 20.
My expectations maybe were greater than what was realistic or even possible given the terrain and the situation.
Art Lang was there. Jeff Stagg, the outfitter who had dropped Eric off at Chipeta Lake, was there. Eric's friend Julia was there too. This ragtag group milled about, awaiting instructions. Most of them, that is. Art took the initiative and approached the commander of Duchesne County's official search and rescue, or SAR team.
I said to him, my name's Art Lang. I just traveled the whole Highline. In fact, I know the Uintas very well. Can I help you with the search? And he saw my backpack on, and he goes, yes, you really can. And I said, I just traveled it, and I know that there is some problem areas that you need to be focusing on.
One of the problems facing the official SAR teams was their personnel didn't have much firsthand experience on the Highline Trail.
So I said, I want to see the map. Let's talk about where you should focus your efforts.
It had been a day and a half since a scoutmaster had come forward with a story about encountering Eric way off the Highline, along Yellowstone Creek. The sheriff's office had searchers out on horseback following up on that lead. Art thought they might be overlooking an area a bit farther to the west, an area he called the navigation crux, meaning the section of greatest difficulty for finding one's way. The crux wasn't one single spot, but instead a series of route-finding challenges.
And I said, the navigation crux is this place, this Oweep in the Lambert Meadows area.
We've talked about this bit of the Highline before. The Oweep Basin and Lambert Meadow is where Art had encountered a large herd of sheep during his hike.
The upper Oweep, close to that navigation crux, was missing a trail because it was just hundreds of sheep trails going every which way, and every blade of grass was down to the nubbins or gone.
Art imagined a scenario where Eric lost the Highline Trail because of sheep damage, or took the wrong path because of a broken trail sign. Maybe while wandering, Eric found a creek and tried to follow it downhill to civilization.
If you're walking totally unguided, you'd be tending to follow the creek down. That's one of the navigation cruxes I was speaking about.
That would have carried Eric down into the trees, where he and his red backpack couldn't be seen from the air.
The Highline is mostly above alpine tundra. I'm guessing 70%, where you can see everywhere, and you can see a pack on the ground easily. So all these overflights would have seen him if he was in the open. I had kind of figured that he wandered off in the woods and had a heart attack, or set up camp in the woods and then tripped on a root and fell off a little cliff or something.
The Duchesne County Sheriff was working under a similar assumption.
And the ground searchers were then focused on forest and places where you couldn't see, and you could miss somebody on the ground 100 feet away, even if they had a red pack, if he's, crouched down or on the ground or in a tent.
The SAR team commander thanked Art for the information. It was just the kind of intel they needed.
So he was very accepting and eager to get my input.
And he put it to use immediately, crafting a plan to blitz this so-called navigation crux with as many of the volunteer searchers as possible. An air ambulance company called Classic Lifeguard had donated a helicopter and flight crew for the day. The SAR commander split the volunteers into teams of 2. He said the helicopter would fly them in. The teams were to work their areas until about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, then return to their drop points so the helicopter could fly them back out.
And then at the end of that, I said, but I'm here to actually go search, so I want you to fly me up into this navigation crux, and I'm going to go looking for this guy.
Art had loaded his backpack with supplies and provisions to last a few days. He didn't want to be flown out after only a few hours. and he didn't want a buddy that would slow him down. He said he was going solo.
And he looked at me and said, I can't let you do that. And I said, you can't let me do it. That's really the wrong way to put it, because I'm either going to walk up there for a day and a half and walk out for a day and a half with only 1 day to search, or you're going to fly me up there and I'll have 4 days to search. So which would you like?
If the SAR team commander agreed to send Art out solo, and Art ended up going missing himself, it would turn an already bad situation into an outright disaster. If Art was injured or killed, the inevitable lawsuit would be a multi-million-dollar fiasco. The buddy system rule was supposed to protect against this. But Art didn't care about the rules.
The sheriff's deputy took pause. He said, let me talk to some people. And he got on the radio and called the actual sheriff. And the sheriff said, let him go in, but he's got to be accompanied.
Art placed his pack in the helicopter, then climbed into the front left seat. 2 Duchesne deputies, the chaperones the sheriff had ordered to accompany him, took seats in the rear.
And so I got to fly in this thing, and there's 2 search and rescue deputies behind me, but at the end of the day, they'd get flown back out that same day, and I'd stay there.
The chopper lifted off from Moon Lake, its rotor wash kicking up a whirlwind of dust. Art watched the landscape below shrink as the chopper climbed, then moved north in the morning light.
Like an elevator going up the Lake Fork drainage.
If you're looking down from above, the Lake Fork drainage forms a giant letter Y. Moon Lake sits at the bottom. Going north from there, you follow the river until it splits about halfway up. The left, or west branch, is the Lake Fork. The right, or east branch, is Oweep Creek. At the very top of the Y, midway between those 2 branches, sits Lambert Meadow. The Uinta Highline Trail cuts across the top of the Y, from one side to the other. That entire stretch encompassed the section of trail Art called the Navigation Crux. Again, the plan for the search was to saturate this crux with as many people as possible. Art and his chaperones were the tip of the spear. The helicopter dropped them in an open space near Lambert Meadow.
I got out with my full pack and started setting my tent up. The aircraft took off, and they were quizzing me, well, are you going to stay here by yourself? You know, there's bears and other dangerous animals here.
Art knew risky wildlife encounters in the Uinta Mountains were rare. The grizzly bears and wolf packs that once inhabited these mountains were killed off by ranchers decades ago. Black bears do still live in the Uintas today, but they tend to be small and shy.
And I said, I'm used to being by myself out here, and I feel bad that you're feeling bad for me. Don't. I'm here by free will, and frankly, I don't need you here to walk around with me. You're supposed to stay there the whole day and start searching. Interesting, because they were not really well equipped to walk much. They had cowboy boots on and jeans and water bottles stuffed in their pockets.
The deputies were from the ranching communities of Duchesne County. They were both used to being outside, but weren't long-distance hikers.
Maybe somebody can walk 10 miles in cowboy boots, but I'd like to see it.
Art didn't get a chance to find out.
Because by the time I got my tent set up, getting ready to start walking, the helicopter shows back up to haul them out.
Back at Moon Lake, Marilyn and Rachel watched as the helicopter came and went. The group of volunteers shrank a little each time the chopper lifted off. Rachel realized she and Marilyn would soon be left alone there.
Me just standing there waiting is not a good use of time.
Rachel still wanted to join the search, and it seemed the opportunity was slipping away. So she approached the SAR team commander. Yes, I know it's dangerous, she said. But look around. You don't have nearly enough people. You need my help. The commander conceded the situation warranted bending the rules. He agreed to send her out with one of the last remaining volunteers. The helicopter would drop Rachel and this other volunteer, a guy named Charlie, in an area called Brown Duck Basin. There was little reason to believe Eric could have ended up there, but it needed to be checked. Rachel said she was ready.
I could not have been less prepared.
Rachel and Charlie would start their search at the top of the basin and jog down a trail back to Moon Lake. The distance would be about equal to running a half marathon.
Fortunately, I'd run a half marathon about 3 weeks before, the only time in my life I've ever done it. But I was probably the fittest that I've ever been, thankfully, because the guy I was paired up with was so fit. It was just, I went, what have I done?
That feeling intensified as the helicopter ascended, affording Rachel a bird's eye view of Brown Duck Basin and the broad expanse of the Uinta Crest beyond. She felt a pang of dread.
The size of it, the scale of it, of the range themselves and what the task was.
As soon as they hit the ground and darted out of the chopper, Charlie started off down the trail. Rachel hurried to follow, worried she wouldn't be able to keep pace.
Adrenaline's an amazing thing. It didn't actually matter.
Rocks the size of watermelons littered the trail. Dead pines blown down by the wind were hurdles in Rachel's path. Every step posed the risk of a sprain or rolled ankle. Her lungs, accustomed to sea-level air, burned in the thinner oxygen at elevation. She shouted Eric's name over and over.
I do remember, though, as we were running, that real reality of what I was going to do if I actually found him. Like this sort of wanting to desperately, like I was dizzy from my head scanning, looking. But then, it was a weird thing. It was so futile. Like, in reality, would this be the moment that we were fortunate enough that it was? But also, what was that actually going to be like?
She couldn't imagine a scenario where Eric greeted her with a smile and a cup of tea, asking what had taken her so long.
I was prepping for worst case. Yeah, maybe that he would be unconscious and alive, but not. I was thinking it would be pretty bad.
She still didn't want to believe Eric could be dead. But finding his lifeless body would be better than not finding him at all.
I obviously wanted it to happen, but had to prep myself in case that was the reality and what that was going to be like. Strange combination of feelings to have, yeah.
It was nearly 10 a.m. by the time the chopper finished flying all the volunteers to their search areas. Eric's friend, Julia, remained behind to be with Marilyn. They traveled together back to the sheriff's office headquarters to attend a briefing with Sheriff Travis Mitchell. Marilyn stood again in the EOC, that big empty room, as the sheriff walked her through everything that had happened so far.
I had my notebook.
Mitchell went day by day as Marilyn scribbled notes, trying to keep up, writing down names of unfamiliar people and places.
My notes are somewhat sketchy.
I've reviewed them, and they're actually quite good. Sheriff Mitchell told Marilyn how he had flown the entire length of the Highline Trail a week earlier to look at each of the passes. Marilyn wrote the words, Dead Horse Pass, Nasty Snow. Mitchell told Marilyn the air ambulance company had already donated tens of thousands of dollars in fuel and flight time to the search, but couldn't keep flying for free, and was going to start charging the sheriff's office.
Helicopter has limited fuel. Pilots have other chores.
Surely there had to be other helicopters, Marilyn said. Why not call in the military or the state governor? The sheriff told her it would cost $5,000 an hour to bring in another chopper.
He told me, it's different, you don't understand, And I emphatically said, well, please explain. I need to know. You need to fill me in on the differences. You need to explain to me how you do things and what is going on.
Marilyn was not the weepy, inconsolable wife Sheriff Mitchell might have expected. She told him she knew a bit about mountains herself, having trekked around Annapurna in Nepal. He didn't need to protect her feelings. Just be blunt, she said.
I was standing around twiddling my thumbs, trying to get my head around a lot of new things of, sketchy, patchy information, and I needed to know.
A KSL TV reporter arrived early that afternoon to update the station's story about Eric.
Now, 8 days after his expected return, Duchesne County Sheriff Travis Mitchell says his deputies are searching a 60-mile-long trail with very little to go on.
We're looking at, on our side of the Uinta Mountains, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 400,000 acres.
Notice how Mitchell said our side. Duchesne County only covered the south slope of the High Uintas. I'll remind you, Summit County was responsible for the north side, but had declined to join the search. The Duchesne County portion alone spanned more than 1,600 square kilometers, an impossibly large area to cover. Sheriff Mitchell told the reporter they needed the public's help to shrink the scope.
Get somebody that's seen him other than where we have now, then we can maybe narrow our search area a little bit smaller. That'd help us immensely.
In the meantime, Marilyn does what little she can, keeping family members up to date as she closely watches the search.
We have 5 children and 9 grandchildren, and it's pretty hard for those back in Australia.
I covered many search and rescue missions during my career as a news reporter. There's often a telling moment when a search drags out where the officials switch from saying rescue to recovery. That's when they admit to themselves and to the public the person they are looking for must be dead. Sheriff Mitchell wasn't calling it a recovery just yet, but Marilyn could sense the shift coming.
I got the sense that hope of a positive finding had fast dwindled.
The chief deputy, Dave Boren, went over detailed weather reports, beginning with the day Eric had last been seen by the Boy Scouts. Scattered storms had moved across the Uintas that day, and for 2 days after. It raised the possibility Eric might have been struck by lightning. Fatalities from lightning are very rare, but your risk for getting injured or killed by lightning increases when you are the tallest thing in an otherwise barren landscape. This point came into sharp focus on that afternoon, when Julia's partner Blake, her friend Devin, and Julia's sister reported in following a search. They'd been out for 3 days, since Saturday.
Blake and Devin and my sister have a story of trying to go over a pass, and it was lightning, and they had to make the choice of run for it back to camp or or stay put. And so there's just a lot of risk with volunteers being out there that you assume.
Electrical storms in the Uintas can be as memorable as they are terrifying. There's nothing like seeing the white flash and hearing the air-rending crack at the same instant. The U.S. National Weather Service describes barren mountain peaks, ridgelines, and wide-open areas as, quote, extremely dangerous terrain for lightning. That all perfectly describes portions of the Uinta Highline Trail, and I had my own close call with lightning during my hike following Eric's path.
Hopefully the wind doesn't make this recording completely inaudible.
I was headed for Porcupine Pass when I found myself trying to outrun a storm.
There are some really ugly clouds off to my right, which would be north. And I just heard some thunder crackling inside the clouds. I'm way above tree line. I'm in wide open tundra. Just rocks, grass, and little bushes about shin high, spaced very sparsely. So if the weather comes in any significant way, I'm going to get the brunt of it.
The Weather Service suggests getting inside a car or building when you see lightning. But I was in the wilderness, with no car or building anywhere in sight. Mountain hikers usually try to get over passes early in the day, when weather tends to be calm. But sometimes, storms don't stick to predictable schedules. I was caught in the open, the tallest thing around, a literal lightning rod.
So if you hear me breathing heavy, that's why. I've got to push.
Cold wind made my sweat feel like ice. I paused to catch my breath before ascending the final few switchbacks to the top of the pass, only to have the sky remind me not to dally.
That's not scary. That's not scary at all. Alright. Walking away from the thunder. Everything to my back is dark, super ugly, really ugly clouds coming over from the north. Like I am just missing this storm. I'm right in front of it.
I crested the top of the pass and looked down into the Oweep Basin, a big, beautiful meadow.
Oh my word. And the view into the O-Weep. There it is. Frickin' O-Weep. Oh my word. That's gorgeous. That is unbelievably pretty.
From my perch at the edge of the precipice, I could see a long wall of cliffs to my left, boxing in the south side of the O-Weep Cirque. The spine of the Uinta crest formed another barrier to my right. Between them sat the O-Weep, a long, narrow valley. The Highline Trail, a thin stripe of brown, cut through the grass far below. The vertical relief made me feel like I was in a Jack and the Beanstalk fable, and the rumble of thunder from behind told me a giant was about to catch me.
It's not a sound I like when I'm standing on a 12,000-foot pass.
You'd better run. You'd better take cover.
Oh my word.
I couldn't help snapping a few pictures first.
We gotta take an iPhone photo of that too. Because I got the ultra-wide camera on the iPhone. And that deserves friggin' ultra-wide. Okay, that's too close. Okay. We got a boogie off of this frickin' pass. That one was too close for comfort.
I shoved my phone in my pocket and scurried to where the trail dropped off the west side of the pass, dragging my trekking poles behind. A blast of what felt like hurricane-force wind slammed into me, right where the Highline Trail plunged off the edge.
Holy cow, okay. I gotta turn this recorder off and get off this hill.
Hailstones pelted the ground as I jogged down the rocky path, lightning peppering the place I'd just been standing. You don't get to hear that thunder, because I put my own safety above standing around to record the sound.
Recorder off.
Lightning can, and has, killed people up here. Marilyn returned to Moon Lake on that Monday afternoon to await Rachel's return. She knew her daughter had taken a risk going out to search, like all the volunteers, and every hour that passed without word from Rachel tightened a knot of anxiety